Well, I've received a variety of reactions to my sermons over the years. I've had people compliment me and tell me it was a good sermon. I've had people critique my sermon politely, trying to explain to me the error of my thinking. I've had people who I suspect have quit attending church because of the content of my sermons. And I've looked into the dull and vacant faces of people who I imagine to be graciously enduring my sermons. But to my good fortune, I've never had anyone try to throw me off a cliff after hearing a sermon, at least not yet. What was it that transformed Jesus' listening audience from people who were initially described as speaking well of him and his gracious words in verse 22 to an angry mob filled with rage just a few verses later? He had just finished reading a passage from the prophet Isaiah, promising good news to the poor and release to the captives and the oppressed, while proclaiming something called the year of the Lord's favor. The year of the Lord's favor would have also been known as the year of Jubilee, something that was commanded to happen every 50 years. On that year, all prisoners and captives were set free, all slaves were released, all debts were forgiven, all property was returned to its original owners, and those bound by labor contracts were released from them. It's a wonderful concept, but was more than likely never actually put into place. But Jesus' audience, having lived under Roman rule for the last 70 years, would have clung to his words with the desperation of a drowning victim. They were long overdue for their year of Jubilee. And here was their hometown boy saying the day had finally arrived. God had finally heard their cries, and Jesus was here to crush their enemies, because after all, that's what messiahs do, don't they? But they should have suspected that something was up when Jesus, while reading from the ancient prophet, left out something. He ended the reading by proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, while omitting the rest of the text that also promised the day of vengeance of our God. It's as if the vengeance these Jews were hoping for was not part of the picture he was painting for them. And to drive his point home in this morning's reading, he provided two sermon illustrations. One about the great prophet Elijah, and the other about Elijah's disciple Elisha. He reminded them of the ancient story of a 3.5 year drought that had resulted in a terrible famine in the land of Israel. So God sent Elijah into the enemy territory of Sidon, where he encountered a widow with a son. And God miraculously multiplied that widow's meager supply of grain and oil so that it never ran out, but instead kept all three of them fed throughout the famine. Jesus points out to his audience that there were plenty of Jewish widows to whom God could have sent Elijah, but God's grace and mercy was so vast that it extended to people beyond the borders of Israel, even to those who were considered enemies of the Jews. And just to make sure that no one missed the point he was making, he told a story of Elisha, Elijah's disciple, and Naaman, the commander of the army of Syria, Israel's adversary. Naaman was plagued with leprosy, and instead of curing any of the many Jewish lepers of their disease, God used Elisha to cure Naaman of his disease. Naaman, who was the sworn enemy of Israel. Well, by this time, there was little doubt in anyone's mind about the message that Jesus was proclaiming, and they didn't like it one bit. Jesus was audaciously claiming that God's favor extended to their enemies, and that's when everything went from bad to worse. The people were so enraged by Jesus' teaching that they drove him out of the synagogue with the intent of throwing him off a nearby cliff. It would almost seem over the top were it not for some of the reactions I've seen to some social media posts when folks don't exactly see eye to eye on politics. We don't like being told that our enemies are God's friends, Barbara Brown Taylor writes. No matter how hard we try, she says, we cannot seem to get God to respect our boundaries. God keeps plowing right through them, inviting us to follow or get out of the way. Last Monday, the president tweeted his support for Bible literacy in public schools. But the president may want to be careful what he hopes for. Whereas I'm sure it's the intent that students learn of the Leviticus text, which declares men who sleep with men to be an abomination, the students' wandering eyes are liable to read the text in the previous chapter, which says, "When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am your sovereign God." For those who would point these students to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah as God's judgment against the LGBT community, they had better hope the students don't discover in the book of Ezekiel, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." There are surely those who will try to justify their attack against the transgender community with Deuteronomy's words, "A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such things as is abhorrent to your sovereign God." But they had better hope the students don't find the Apostle Paul's words that there is no longer male and female, or his statement that the whole law is summed up in a single commandment, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." My point is the same one that Jesus was making in his very first sermon, which offended his listening audience. We don't get to box up God inside our prejudices, expecting God to condemn the same people we condemn. God is too big for that. We don't get to create our own narrative about a God who respects the walls we build to separate us from others. God, it seems to me, is calling us from our places of conflict, our places of comfort, security, and privilege, to not only show compassion to those who are less fortunate than we, but to realize that there is no place in God's world for walls that separate people from each other. There is no us and no them. And if we believe differently, then we are hypocrites and liars when we pray for God's will on earth as it is in heaven. I want to close today with a story about the Israelites who escaped from the pursuing Egyptians. According to the Exodus account, Moses held out his staff and the Red Sea was parted by God. The Israelites walked on the exposed dry ground and crossed the sea, followed by the Egyptian army. Moses again moved his staff once the Israelites had crossed and the sea closed again, drowning the entire Egyptian army. But according to Jewish Midrash, when the angels began to join the Israelites in their song of victory, God said to them, "My creations are drowning, and you are singing before me?" Our enemies are not God's enemies. God's grace and mercy is too big for the petty differences we have with each other. Differences which give way to paranoia, and paranoia which gives way to cruelty and bloodshed. There is no place in God's kingdom for this sort of thing. And for those of us who claim to be followers of Christ, there's no place in our lives for it either. Amen.